Morning, church. Oh, I just love Bilingual Sunday. Do you guys as well? I know we don't do it very often, but I am happy when we get a chance to. This morning, I want to start off with a scripture reading. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, 16 through 20. It's Paul talking here to the Corinthians about the ministry that's been entrusted to us, and this fits within the context of what we've been talking about these past 5 weeks. So read along with me here. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we no longer know him in this way. Again, we have got to have eyes, and I've been saying this for the past few weeks, on this countercultural mission, on this ability to discern what's going on out in culture. We have got to discipline ourselves to view things differently. Verse 17, so if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Look, new things have come into being. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. Not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to who? Us. He didn't count it against them, and he was reconciling people to God. Therefore, we should not count it against them, so that we can then reconcile them to God. And we read about this last week. We talked about how in this very same, or actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul says that we have got to treat the world differently than we treat internally. He's not talking about we got to go out in the world and tell them where they're all doing bad. But in the church, we have got to grow. We can't continue to misbehave. We can't continue to sit on the sidelines and coast through life because of our grace and forgiveness. We are being called into reconciling people. And the first place we've got to reconcile is in the body. We've got to reconcile the next generation to God so that they can go out and do the ministry that Christ called us to do, right? They can then do. So we are ambassadors for Christ since God is making his appeal through us. Over the past few weeks, we've been using this book here, Faith for Exiles, to kind of help steer us specifically on this ministry of reconciliation with our own youth, this next gen that is coming up, who we have been studying about, reading about, are living in this Babylonian kind of captivity we've been calling digital Babylon. We did our series back in the spring over faith of exiles, over this idea that we have to think of ourselves like the first Christians living in Rome, as people living in exile. We are different from the culture. We have to recognize one of three things: that we are either going to assimilate into culture and look no different, that we are going to isolate, we are going to pull away from culture and be so far different that we can't even do reconciliation, or we're going to differentiate like Christ did. We're going to be in, but not of, so that we can bring people to God. A few weeks ago, Kevin Huddleston shared that the main topic, or that one of the ways that we have got to instill in our young folks is this idea of intimacy with Jesus. I talked a few weeks ago about we've got to train them to discern culture, to look in and ask those questions about where is God in this? What is this saying about humanity, and where is hope and encouragement? Jake King, our new youth minister, came up and talked about the importance of having intergenerational relationships, and those things, like we were talking about Billy Kelm this morning. Billy's been around a long time. Billy was an elder younger than I am today, and he's been an elder for a long time. Isn't that crazy, Billy? Would anybody want me to be an elder right now? Probably not. But I will tell you this, when I got here, and I'm looking at some of these elders out here, they put up with the young me. They probably had grounds to fire me at least a couple times, but they put up with me, and helped me learn to discern, learn to control my tongue a little bit better. Still working on that, as I probably always will. And Jake talked about the importance of that as well. Bob came up and talked about the importance of looking at our jobs, our vocations as opportunities for discipleship. And last week I talked about the importance of us getting kids out of their selfishness, out of this I am focus and into the I am focus of being on a countercultural mission. And I'm pleased to invite up our guest today that I'm going to be interviewing. It's the author of this book, a guy I have known for quite a few years. In fact, the first time I really met Mark, Mark invited the area Church of Christ youth ministers from all over DFW to his house. And we shared a meal with him. He doesn't live too terribly far away from here. But Mark has been working with youth pastors, students, and parents for more than 20 years. He's spoken to more than 1 million teenagers. He is the principal at Wisdom Works, a consulting firm that helps Christian leaders leverage the transforming power of wisdom to accomplish their mission. Mark is the former executive director of Youth Specialties and creator of Planet Wisdom student conferences. In his spare time, he writes books for us, for teens, for parents. He has spoken at our National Conference on Youth Ministries, which is an organization run by youth ministers for youth ministers in the churches of Christ. And we have been blessed to have him be a part of that, his education, his wisdom. And Mark has a unique passion for really wanting to do reconciliation of the next generation, for really wanting these people, these youth, to really stay engaged in their faith after high school, after college, and to have those good building blocks. And so I'm going to invite Mark up to come up here with me. Y'all can welcome him.
Thanks, Beau.
Mark, I'm glad you could be here with us this morning. It's probably a little different than what you're used to.
It is, actually, because our church is in the afternoon, so I get to do 2 church services today. So
Bless your heart. Bless your heart. Yeah, I'm glad you were able to come here and be with us this morning, and I'm really thankful that you wrote this book back in 2019, and I'm kind of wondering a little bit about a few things about it. One is COVID's happened since then.
Yes, it has.
Some things have changed a little bit with that, and you've kept up your work. I was talking to you last week, and you're traveling all over the place. It seems like there's other churches out there that struggle with some of the same things we struggle with, coming out of COVID, trying to re-engage people.
Not just in the United States, but around the globe. I've been in Dubai, I've been in Singapore, meeting with churches from literally every inhabited continent. And this is the topic that's
this
being
next
discussed.
gen and
next
engaging
generation.
this next gen.
Yeah,
what have you seen over the last few years that you would add to if you were writing this book today, maybe?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just commend the church that you would take 5 weeks or however long it's been and actually explore this as a congregation is remarkable. And that is just amazing to me. It gave me great encouragement. David Kinnaman, my co-author, who's also done a lot of things with Dudley at Oklahoma Christian, and we've done a lot of research with Pepperdine and Abilene Christian as well. We don't see this happen very much. The church says we want to really explore this deeply.
Yeah.
And we did this right before the pandemic, is when this book released. And in a way, it was a little prophetic, because what we were kind of saying was there's a generation that literally has their hand on the door in the church. They're just waiting for the right opportunity to turn the knob and walk through the door out to leave. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we saw happen. And we actually did the same.
So they're in the church, and they're just looking for an opportunity to get out.
Correct. So this was like, this was a follow-up to a book David did called You Lost Me.
Yes.
And we were really exploring kind of why are people leaving the church. And I actually helped David do the data analytics on that, try to understand the insights of what was going on with that. And what we found was, well, gee, it's interesting. The great thing about doing research is there's always going to be more business, because one research project leads to another research project, because you only answer some questions and you create more. And one of the things is, well, wow, there are a lot of young people leaving the church, but there's a lot that are staying. Why are they staying? What's going on with them? And that was what this book was about exploring, was that. So as we dove into that, we did the same survey in the middle of the pandemic, and sure enough, we found that what we called habitual churchgoers, those that went to church but weren't really connected to Christ as deeply.
So maybe they just showed up at things.
And they showed up pretty regularly. I
Okay.
think that's what was pretty remarkable to David and I was, there's two words that we, the whole book is, 5 ways for a new generation to follow Jesus in digital Babylon. And the idea is that discipleship in Babylon looks very different than discipleship in Jerusalem. And so one of the things we call it digital Babylon, because while a lot of churches have said, well, the internet hasn't really disrupted us that much.
Churches still say that?
They do. It can compared to other industries,
Sure.
right, that have been totally upended by the internet. But what's happened has been a little more insidious because people basically have been being discipled by screens. So screens disciple. And I went and visited my doctor not too long ago, and when I walked in, he said, "So what do you think you got?" And I was like, "Well, that's why I'm here, is for you to tell me what I have." And he goes, "Well, I know you've Googled all your symptoms. You have, you know that you either have, stomach flu or you're dying of pancreatic cancer."
Right.
And I said, "Yes, it's one of those extremes."
Right.
And you're here to help me figure it out. But he said, I come in knowing that you've already been on a medical journey, and I need to know where you're at in that and what you know. He goes, "I learn things from my patients by asking them that question, but I'm also able to figure out where their head's at." And the light went on when that happened, because I thought to myself, that's what's happening with our young people. They're going to screens before they're going to people for help and guidance spiritually. And so we have to realize that screens are discipling our kids.
Right.
The average young person is taking less than 300 hours of spiritual content a year, but they're taking almost 3,000 hours of screen content in total. So less than 10% is actual spiritual content.
Wow.
So that's shaping them. That's informing them.
Right.
And where a young person would normally maybe come to me in my church and say, "Hey, Mark, I'm struggling with my faith. Help me figure this out." They're going on Google and they're going on their own journey that I may or may not know about. And here's the thing. They're showing up to church every Sunday. So from all the outside optics, it looks like they're totally engaged. They're singing, they're going on mission trips, but there's another internal journey going on that may be leading them away from Christ. And we're not a part of it unless we engage it. And what we found is that during the pandemic, that habitual group of churchgoers, they were the ones that decreased the most in terms of their participation.
Right.
In church.
They're getting their connection, they're getting their information from the full of truth internet, right?
Yep.
And they have no ability to discern what they're reading back to Scripture, back to context without our help, and they're doing it on their own.
Yes.
And then they show up here and they know how to play the game.
Yes.
They know how to look the part. They know how to engage. They know how to act.
Yeah, and it may not even be that they're doing it out of disingenuousness, right? I mean, it may just be like they're just
part
literally,
of their culture.
They're just trying to find their way,
Right.
And so they come here, they do certain things out of habit, but it's not going into a deeper connection, and that's kind of what the book was trying to tease out. And I think it's really important because older generations use the internet almost as frequently, but for really different reasons, and so it's hard for us to understand perspective on that. And I remember the first time I got a window into that. So I was really blessed that I had two sets of grandparents that loved Jesus and followed him with their lives. They were not vocational ministers in any way, shape, or form, but they planted a church in California as part of a small group from another church. They planted our church. My brother now is the pastor of that church, interestingly enough.
Okay.
I have four of us are ordained in my sibling group. And it's kind of interesting because I remember with my grandmother one Sunday, they were making some changes to the worship service. And we would go to lunch after as a family after the service. And she and I were talking, and she said, "I do not like what's happening." And I said, what do you mean? She goes, "Oh, the changes they're making and the order and all this." She goes, I don't like it. And I said, "Well, Grandma, you got to get with the times, This is where things are going, and this is where things are moving." And she said something to me, and it made me appreciate her. She said, "Mark, I've seen a lot of change in my life." And at that time, home computers were just starting to come on the scene. This is when I was in middle school. Think about what has happened just since then. I mean, I think in my lifetime, what I've experienced and what she experienced, she said, I've seen so much change. The one thing I just don't want to change is the way I worship on Sunday. And that made me go, this isn't a battle over old people and young people. This is a sensitivity that we need to have about, what, I want my grandmother to feel that comfort and that satisfaction.
For this to be edifying for her.
Yeah. And at the same time, she was having a dialogue with me and understanding why this other thing was more meaningful to her, to me.
Right.
And I think that's a healthy thing. Rather than separating generationally, which is what's happening around our country, generations are not understanding one another. We've got to really learn to appreciate and value what the other brings. And the millennial generation, which millennials are now in their 40s, so it's, if you're thinking of somebody in their 20s, that's Gen Z. Okay. But millennials were the first generation that literally had a different imagination than other generations prior. And what I mean by that is, it used to be you had to pay your dues to be able to have access to resources. But the millennials literally grew up in this digital age where all of the barriers to production, to marketing, to distribution were gone. They could create something in their garage and distribute it around the world. Instantly. And they could find jobs easier because they had the internet to be able to find jobs. So, I remember, employees would just leave, and say, I quit, and they would just leave, and all those millennials. And I said, are they really not just doing what we all wish we could have done? We just didn't have the means to be able to do it. And they had already, before they quit, they probably found a job, underneath the desk on the internet. So they were leaving one job to another, maybe. But I'm just saying they had the ability to do that, right? And so, but what that means is that as older generations, what we learned along the way of building what we built, that we learned wisdom. This generation has access to all this capacity. What they don't have yet is wisdom. And so we as an older generation have that wisdom to give to the younger generation. But what I'm finding is older generations are wanting to withhold it from them and say, you don't deserve it. And so what there is there's a tension generationally that's happening in our churches. But at the same time, we have a generation that has a whole new imagination around an economy, a globe, the church that is really different. And we need to give them a little more access because they have the means to leave and do it.
A little more purpose.
Yeah. And Gen Z, they're in a whole different place, right? Where millennials, they'll just leave your church. Gen Z will burn it down on their way out the door. Oh. So, it's a whole different energy there, as my friend and the cultural anthropologist John David Seal says. So anyway, it's just an interesting, tension between that. But I think it's really important that we really take time to understand and value what's there in another generation. And it may take the wisdom of older generations to be the ones proactive on that.
I would think that it would take an older generation and their wisdom because the younger generation doesn't have it to seek it.
Yeah.
They're so used to easy seeking, Googling, all that kind of stuff, and they're not going to necessarily be proactive about going to wiser people and asking for information until it's of utmost importance, until it's crisis, until it's...
What we're finding is that millennials and younger, they want the wisdom of the older generation. It's just that the older generation isn't always willing to give it to them without a lot of strings attached.
Gotcha.
And we have to value the fact that this generation doesn't necessarily need it. What we see happening in the church is because younger pastors can do 10x what pastors previously could do with growing their congregations, establishing a ministry of influence through writing and blogging and podcasting and things like that. But what they don't have is the character to support that capacity. And so what we see is a lot of lives collapsing at a younger age because their lives can't support the growth that they can experience, not just in the church, but outside the church as well in business. So as older generations, we really have an opportunity to do that. It usually requires us, though, to say, hey, I value what I see in you, and I see opportunity here. I want to give you this is going to be difficult for both of us.
Sure.
I'm going to frustrate you, and you're going to frustrate me. I can guarantee you that. But I would like to give you an opportunity to speak into things, because this generation has a different way of imagining the future that we don't have.
And we've got to be willing to let go a little bit.
We have to be willing to let go of it if it's going to thrive.
Yeah.
And I think as a church, we've always said, we're one body, and we all have many parts. Except you don't get to be a part of the body until you reach a certain age. And whatever that is, and
Sure.
every denomination has a different way of looking at that.
Right.
But at the same time, we need to say, the younger generation, if they have put their trust in Christ, they are in Christ. They are part of the body, and that means they are essential to all of our
Body
existence.
life, right.
Yeah.
So, all good stuff, and I'd let you talk for an hour, but I do want to kind of touch a couple of
we do
key
have a time
points.
limit.
In the text here, out of these 5 ways you talk about instilling these habits and this character into these younger generations in this digital Babylon, is there a particular one that you find most fascinating, or maybe it's most difficult, or maybe it's most encouraging?
Yeah, the one that's really challenging right now is the living on countercultural mission.
Talk about that.
Because a lot of times, especially in our current climate in our country, there is a sense that means being at war with culture.
Okay.
And
so it's not at war with culture.
That's not what living on countercultural means, right? If we think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, right? They were not taking on the Babylonian culture.
They weren't trying to shut it down.
No, they came, they learned everything they could, they were serving in high positions, but when it came down to moments of trust, am I trusting in man or am I trusting in God? They leaned into trusting into God. But they didn't make a show of it. I mean, when you think about Daniel and the edict comes down to pray, he doesn't go into the center of town and start praying out loud. He goes back to his room, he throws open his windows to Jerusalem as he always did, and he prayed there. And they came and spied on him and found him out and threw him in the lion's den. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they just happened to be in a public place. And when they were asked to bow down to the idol, but it wasn't like they're like, we're going to show the king. Like when they go before the king, they treat him with great respect. Oh, king, we don't need to defend ourselves in this matter. The God that we serve is able to save us from your furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to that image, because that would mean putting trust somewhere else. But they weren't looking for a fight to pick. It wasn't like they go, hey, I think he's going to make us bow down to this image. Let's go there and get a good seat so that everybody sees it. That wasn't what their intention was. It was just in that moment, a moment of epic trust. They trusted God. And that's the kind of lives that we need to live in the current culture. It's not about picking a fight with culture. It's about displaying incredible trust in God and allowing God to show up in miraculous ways, or sometimes not. Sometimes we might live, we might die. Esther says the same thing when she goes into the king, right? I may live, I may die, but you know what? I'm going to be used by God in this moment. I'm going to trust him, and not the consequences of what's going on.
I really like this metaphor, because you pick 3 characters out of exile, specifically Babylonian exile. You've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to pray to the idol. You've got Daniel, who says, I'm going to still pray to my God, even though king has been conned into making this rule. And then you've got Mordecai and Esther, and going to the king, even though it is wrong to go.
Yeah.
And saying, you know what, I'm still going to do this, because even if I die doing it, I have still trusted that God is going to take care of these people. And this is all happening in the same time.
And this happens in Esther without even mentioning God.
It never mentions God
once.
once.
We see it, right? I mean, this is a book that today we would go, this shouldn't even be in the Bible. It doesn't even mention God, yet we see God all in it, right? It is the perfect book for us in exile to realize we can still trust in God. You don't even have to see his name mentioned, and trust in God is evident.
Right, and even in Ezra, Nehemiah, that's happening at the same time, and you see the war against culture happening over there, the isolation from culture and how damaging that is. And then you have inside of Babylon this assimilation of people and how damaging that is. And you have these characters who are on a countercultural mission, but they're not trying to burn Babylon down.
Correct.
They're trusting that God's got them.
Right, and in Jeremiah, God tells the exiles, seek the peace and prosperity of the city.
Right.
For if the city prospers, you will prosper. And he says, lay down roots and plant seed and reap the harvest of that fruit. So he's not just talking about doing one action. He's talking about being in it for the long haul, season after season, generation after generation. Joseph's another great example.
Sure.
Right? So here's Joseph is cast into exile in a really different way. He's a victim of abuse. Right? And he is thrown in to live among the Egyptians. And what does he do? Cross his arms and go, this isn't fair. This is wrong. The chips are stacked against me. No, he serves. He does the best that he possibly can be. And what ends up happening, he saves not only Israel, but Egypt as well.
Right.
And is a testimony to the God of Abraham.
So this countercultural mission, and I love the metaphor. I think it's metaphor at the same time. I also think it is just so, it makes the Old Testament really come alive for a modern, but this digital Babylon.
Yeah.
This, you look back in the Old Testament, where'd you get that idea? I mean, as an author,
yeah.
I bet you get flooded with ideas all the time.
We get flooded with ideas all the time.
How'd you get there?
Well, the way we got there was just really kind of looking at what is going on in the culture and kind of realizing that, we've all noticed there's a reason why we're, kind of in this, identity crisis as a country, right? And it's not just happening in the United States. It's happening all over, and not just in Christian nations, but in Hindu nations too. There's a huge Hindu nationalist movement happening in India trying to kind of make India great again. And it's very similar to what we see happening in Europe, happening in the U.S., because the internet, the digitalization of everything has made us more aware of the diversity that's always existed. So where we were able to kind of wall off and kind of be homogeneous, we're now experiencing the plurality of life that you would experience in a Babylon, right?
Gotcha.
And so now we're
because everybody's been moved around and lives intermixed.
Yeah.
Digitally,
yeah,
we've been
and it
moved
throws
around.
you off. It
Right.
creates a little disequilibrium, right? What's going on? And so what we want to do is grasp onto what we know, traditions and things of that nature, rather than understanding the moment. And as we try to double down on that, it's like, it's not going to help us. We have to, as God's people.
It takes us off mission because now we fight culture when we're called to love culture and be at peace with it. Where Christ says, "Father, bless them, even though they're not of this world, they still have to be in this world." He doesn't remove us from it.
Well, into the passage that you just read from 2 Corinthians 5, right? So one of the hard things is that people go, "Well, that's an Old Testament idea, this exileship." Well, I would say that based on the passage that you've read and others, that exileship is how we are regenerated into exileship.
Constantly.
And in the United States, we are kind of like, because we are blessed to live in a country that values the freedoms and the liberties that God values, it is sometimes hard for us to think of ourselves as living in exile. We've used, language was used during the revolution of, we're the New Jerusalem, we're the city on a hill, all of this kind of thing, right? And so we tend to think of ourselves as not still living in Babylon.
We're in Jerusalem.
Still living in exile, yeah. And the language that Paul uses there in 2 Corinthians 5, you are therefore Christ's ambassadors. An ambassador is a resident alien, somebody of high rank, but representing a foreign entity. And so, Peter goes on to say, think of yourselves as aliens and strangers. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they will glorify God. They'll see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he returns. And so I think there's something really powerful about realizing that this Old Testament idea of exile is actually a New Testament everyday reality. Where Israel moved in and out of exile, we are regenerated as believers into exile. And that's kind of where that idea came from, was trying to help people realize we're living in a different world and it's not going back. And maybe it never was. It's just that the digitization is making us realize how diverse we are.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think at some level, I would assume then that if our culture thought it was Christian, or it was mainly, that's what was perceived and seen, kind of the habitual Christianity of the culture, that the digital age is pushing us to see the real truth. Yes. That there are nominal Christians, or what I call CEOs, Christian, Christmas, Easter only type Christianity out there. And then there are the true disciples, the guys that are willing to sacrifice themselves to live for the sake of others, to do the hard work of loving God and loving others, and discern in that. And this book, I will say, has been a real help to me. and hopefully it will be to others as we've talked about it and pursue that. And I just want to appreciate you for driving over here today, and thank
My
you
pleasure.
for being here.
Yeah, I was happy to do it.
Yeah, and I wish we could have more time with you, but I assume there's another book, there's some other things coming out. Is there something else
There is.
coming out?
I just took the month of February off to put together the next project.
Okay.
So we've identified that there are about 100 million Americans that are what we call spiritually curious. Yet the church does not necessarily know how to engage them.
Okay.
We tend to think of the atheist as the pipe-smoking, tweed-wearing, evolutionist, and as being the people that are against us, and it's actually a little more nuanced than that. And so we've
Okay.
been exploring that and
So we
doing
can
research.
expect some stuff that'll help us be mission focused.
Yes. I want to can I make two little closing comments?
Absolutely.
The first, because I know this church is a missional church. Bob was just telling me all the different countries that you are going to be ministering to over the summer. One of the things that this book was the foundational work that we did with several different ministries globally. We took some of the same concepts and we looked at Christian young people in 25 different countries around the world. What we found is that young people have more in common with each other from different countries than they do the generation above them in their own country. That's how strong the generational divide is globally.
Wow.
But it also says, what is God doing with this generation? That he's connecting them and giving them a common language, a common world experience that will allow them to be really strong as a global church moving forward. And so I think that is a really exciting concept. Yeah. And then the second thing I just want to say is this. Esther, right? She is told for such a time as this. Mm-hmm. And when we hear those words, we often think about them being spoken to us. We are the Esther. I want to challenge you to think of the one who spoke them to her, Mordecai. Mordecai says, he sees the situation and he says, Esther's been put in this situation. She has this moment for such a time as this. As older generations, let this be our Mordecai moment. Mm. Let us be the moment when we realize this is our opportunity to inspire and to equip and resource a new generation to say, for such a time as this, God is doing something wonderful and new and fresh in the world. It's not for my generation. As much as I would like to be a part of it, kind of like David wanted to build the temple, right. And then God says, nah, Solomon's going to get to do that. Right. That wasn't for you. Right. There's some things that just aren't for us that we're older. As much as we'd like to be a part of them, they're for that younger generation. Okay, it's our job to be Mordecai and challenge them to live into it. So I want to leave you with that today. This is our Mordecai moment.
Mark, thanks for being here this morning.
You bet.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.